Denzel Washington was never the kind of man to back down. He built his name through decades of grit, intelligence, and unshakable presence. But no one expected that same presence to echo inside the chambers of America's highest court. When Chief Justice John Roberts tried to put him in his place, the entire courtroom braced for a moment of humiliation. What followed, though, stunned every observer and left even the most seasoned legal minds scrambling to catch up. Like and subscribe for more stories that challenge what you think you know. The gallery was packed, not with reporters, not with politicians, but with people, ordinary Americans. They had come for what was supposed to be a procedural hearing. Something dry, something technical. Yet the air crackled with tension. Sitting alone at the defendant's table in a sharply tailored navy suit was Denzel Washington. Why was he there? Was this some kind of publicity stunt? A calculated move by an actor to elevate his image? Or had something far deeper brought him into the lion's den of the United States Supreme Court? Judge John Roberts adjusted his robe, his expression unreadable but stiff. He was not used to spectacle, especially not in his courtroom. This chamber was a place of protocol, of precision, of precedent. Not one for theatrics, certainly not the kind brought in by a man better known for his roles on screen than arguments on constitutional law. But Denzel was not smiling. He was not charming. He was not even speaking. He was focused. The case itself had sparked controversy, a civil liberties issue buried beneath layers of legal language, but with real consequences for millions. Denzel had not been subpoenaed. He had volunteered, representing not just himself, but a group of citizens who claimed they had been quietly stripped of a key constitutional protection. Lawyers had scoffed, legal experts had shaken their heads, but here he was, facing the most powerful judges in the land, and doing it alone. John Roberts leaned forward. "Mr. Washington, the court acknowledges your right to speak on behalf of the petitioners, though your credentials are unconventional." His voice was measured, but underneath it, a note of condescension rang clear. There was a pause. Denzel rose. No papers, no notes, just a glance around the room and a calm breath. "With respect, Your Honor, the Constitution is not reserved for the credentialed. It is written for the governed." A ripple moved through the audience. Even Justice Sotomayor raised an eyebrow. Roberts narrowed his eyes. "And yet, legal interpretation requires more than performance." "This is not a film set, Mr. Washington." Denzel's reply was immediate. "Correct. And it is also not a private club. This court exists to serve the people, not protect itself from them." There it was, the first collision. But the tension did not subside. It grew. Why was Roberts visibly irritated? Had he already judged Denzel before a single argument had been presented? Was this about ego, about tradition, or about something more dangerous? The fear that someone outside the inner circle might actually challenge the rules and win. Denzel continued, his voice steady. "The issue before this court is not about politics. It is about power. Who has it, who controls it, and who is allowed to speak against it?" One of the justices shifted uncomfortably. The silence in the room thickened. For a moment Roberts said nothing. He stared at Denzel, perhaps waiting for him to falter. But he did not. Denzel pressed on, citing precedent from obscure decisions decades earlier. He referenced case law with surgical clarity, not as if he had memorized it, but as if he had lived it. It was not just impressive. It was undeniable. Was it possible? Could this man, this outsider, have uncovered a legal truth that even the highest judges had ignored? A hushed murmur passed through the rows of clerks behind the bench. Roberts glanced to his left, then to his right. Something was shifting, not just in the courtroom, but in him. Because what he saw in Denzel Washington was no longer an actor with something to prove. It was a citizen who had come armed with knowledge, purpose, and the confidence to stand against one of the most exclusive institutions in the country. And for the first time, Roberts wasn't sure how to respond. Roberts leaned back, his eyes fixed on Denzel, but his posture now betrayed a new tension. He had expected defiance, maybe even showmanship. What he had not expected was the unshakable calm of a man who had already done the homework, and done it better than half the lawyers who regularly stood in that chamber. The courtroom, once stiff with protocol, had shifted. Something intangible hung in the air now, and everyone felt it. The bailiffs were still. The clerks had stopped typing. The justices sat a little straighter in their chairs. Roberts cleared his throat, attempting to reassert control. "Mr. Washington, we do not dispute the public's right to access justice. What is being questioned here is your interpretation of constitutional reach. You are arguing that Section 45 should extend to circumstances it was never written for." Denzel didn't flinch. He stepped forward slightly, his hands loosely clasped. "With respect, Your Honor, Section 45 wasn't written for the circumstances we face today because those who wrote it couldn't imagine the scale of today's overreach. But they did imagine tyranny, and they built safeguards to prevent it, even when the tools of that tyranny change form." It was not just a rebuttal. It was a challenge, one that forced Roberts to look beyond the technicalities and see the broader implications, the kind of argument that demanded moral clarity, not just legal gymnastics. Justice Kagan tilted her head, now visibly intrigued. "Mr. Washington, are you implying this court has been complicit in eroding those safeguards?" Denzel looked her directly in the eyes. "I am saying the erosion did not happen in darkness. It happened in full daylight, while the guardians of liberty were watching." A hush fell again, deeper than before. The gallery wasn't shifting in their seats anymore. They were frozen. No one moved. No one whispered. The boldness of the accusation hadn't offended them. It had struck a chord. John Roberts raised a hand, as if to summon order, though none had been lost. "You are treading on very thin ground, Mr. Washington. Accusing this court of moral failure is a serious allegation." "And yet," Denzel replied, "if moral failure cannot be spoken in this room, then where? If truth cannot echo from this bench, then what is the bench for?" The question pierced deeper than the statement. It was not rhetorical. It was surgical. Not a performance, but a scalpel to the institution's conscience. And Roberts knew it. The Chief Justice glanced toward the transcript being typed in real time, as if to double-check that yes, those words had indeed been spoken. His own hands curled slightly on the bench. "You have made your point. Do you have legal grounding to support this theory, or are we debating philosophy?" That was the last straw. Without hesitation, Denzel opened a slim leather folder he had placed under the table. He drew out a single printed sheet, held it up, and then handed it to the clerk. "May it please the court, Exhibit A, a series of correspondences between federal agencies confirming the withholding of key civil protections in cases exactly like those being argued today, undisclosed. Until now." Roberts blinked. The clerk handed the paper up the line. One by one, each justice examined it. Denzel stood still, arms at his sides, unflinching. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just waited. Kagan furrowed her brow as she read. Alito leaned in closer. Sotomayor's pen stopped moving entirely. Even Thomas looked unsettled. And Roberts just stared at the page. His jaw tightened. His brows drew down. This was no longer theater. He had tried to dress Denzel down with judicial superiority. He had expected an amateur. Instead, he found himself holding a document that should have been disclosed by federal counsel months ago, and was only now surfacing because Denzel Washington, a private citizen, had put in the work no one else had. The Chief Justice finally looked up. "Where did you get this?" "Through legal channels," Denzel answered coolly. which were available to anyone who had bothered to look. It wasn't arrogance, it was truth, delivered not as a weapon, but as a mirror. Roberts set the paper down. His fingers lingered on it a moment longer, almost as if he were weighing it. Not just physically, but ethically. The courtroom had gone from tense to reverent, from skeptical to awed. And somewhere deep inside, Roberts felt it, that uncomfortable sensation he rarely encountered. A shift, a recognition, not of defeat, but of reckoning. Denzel Washington had not come to entertain. He had come to hold the court accountable. The tension in the chamber had become something entirely different. It was no longer driven by skepticism or spectacle, but by the slow and undeniable realization that something rare was happening. A man who had never studied at an Ivy League law school, who had never clerked under a judge, who had never stood behind a podium in a courtroom before, was commanding the attention of the most powerful legal minds in the country. And not because of fame, because of merit. Justice Gorsuch broke the silence, his voice quiet but direct. "Mr. Washington, the correspondence you submitted indicates systemic neglect. Are you asserting this amounts to willful circumvention of due process?" Denzel turned toward him. "Yes, Your Honor, and not just willful, but strategic. The mechanisms used were subtle, temporary authorizations, obscure memos, but with very permanent consequences. No court challenge, no public hearing, just silent adjustments behind bureaucratic curtains." A few rows back, legal scholars exchanged stunned glances. They had dismissed this hearing as symbolic, a public gesture from a Hollywood figure trying to stay relevant. But they were now scribbling notes as fast as they could, because what was unfolding wasn't just a spectacle. It was history. Roberts looked down, elbows on the bench, his hands folded tightly. He had not spoken again since reading the document. His mind was racing, not with how to undermine Denzel, but how this had slipped past the eyes of the entire judiciary, and more disturbingly, why none of the people within the system had sounded the alarm. "Mr. Washington," he finally said, lifting his gaze, "do you believe the court has failed in its duty to the people?" Denzel paused, not out of hesitation, but to choose his words with care. "I believe the court is not measured by its intentions, but by its outcomes. If the rights of everyday citizens are silently erased in the name of security or convenience, then yes, the court has failed. And if a citizen cannot speak up without credentials, then we are no longer a republic, we are a caste." A wave of electricity seemed to pass through the crowd. His words were not empty rhetoric. They cut to the foundation of what this institution stood for. Justice Barrett leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Washington, some may argue you are weaponizing moral clarity in a legal setting. That passion has no place in constitutional interpretation." To that, Denzel nodded slowly. "I agree that passion alone is dangerous, but detachment without accountability is worse. The Constitution is not a cold document, it's a living promise, and when that promise is broken, emotion is not a distraction, it's a warning." And then he did something no one expected. He reached into his folder again, pulling out a second document. This one was even more alarming. A list of individuals, minority citizens, veterans, whistleblowers, who had been affected by the policy in question. Not in theory. In practice, names, faces, stories, many without representation, most without options. "This is not abstract," he said, laying the paper down. "This court's silence has consequences." The document was passed again, hand to hand. No justice spoke for a moment, because now it wasn't about law. It was about people. John Roberts had spent his life preserving the court's legacy, guarding its traditions, shielding it from public opinion when needed. But for the first time, he saw that tradition had not always equaled justice. That silence, in some cases, had not preserved dignity. It had preserved denial. Roberts slowly removed his glasses, wiping them against his robe, a rare sign of discomfort. "How did you come into possession of these names?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. "I listened," Denzel said. "I listened to those no one else had time for. I sat with them, asked questions, read their files, reviewed documents. Not as a lawyer, as a citizen." The response struck something deep, not just in Roberts, but in the entire bench. Because this was the role they were meant to serve. Not as untouchable arbiters, but as guardians of the people's voice. It was in that moment the tone of the hearing changed completely. The justices, once skeptical, now began asking real questions, technical ones, substantive ones. They were no longer trying to catch him in a misstep. They were trying to understand how he had seen what they had missed. Even the spectators noticed. Heads began to nod. Murmurs of agreement passed softly from row to row. Denzel was not there to prove he was smarter than the court. He was there to remind the court of what it had sworn to protect. And as John Roberts sat back, his brow deeply furrowed, one thing had become unmistakably clear. This was no longer about embarrassment. It was about awakening. The court's stillness had turned solemn. The silence now was not awkward, but reverent. It was the kind of silence that filled the room when people realized they had underestimated someone and were now witnessing the consequences of their own arrogance. Justice Sotomayor shifted in her seat, holding the list Denzel had provided just moments ago. Her voice was unusually soft when she spoke. "These are the forgotten cases," she said aloud. "The ones that never made it to trial. The ones buried in the system's silence." Denzel nodded. "They were never given a headline. They were never seen as precedents. But they represent the erosion of the rule of law in the most intimate way. When rights are quietly denied, the damage is never loud. It is lasting." The weight of his words pressed heavily on everyone present. No longer was this a mere hearing. No longer was this a celebrity moment gone viral. This had become a reckoning, and at the center of it stood a man who had once been dismissed as an outsider. John Roberts leaned forward, his hands now clasped before him, elbows resting on the edge of the bench. His eyes no longer held superiority. They held recognition. "You present a powerful argument," he said carefully. "But what remedy are you asking this court to consider?" It was the moment most had anticipated. The pivot from criticism to proposal. Would Denzel call for indictments, new laws, sweeping reforms? But instead, he did something far more profound. "I am not asking for power," he said. "I am asking for accountability. For this court to acknowledge the harm of its silence, to issue a statement, not of law, but of responsibility, to admit that it turned its eyes away when the Constitution cried out for attention." Some scoffed under their breath. A statement, that was all, but others knew better. For the Supreme Court, an admission of failure, even in words, was seismic. It would set precedent. It would open the door for litigation, investigation, and, yes, reform. Justice Kagan spoke next. "Are you aware that such a statement could fundamentally change public trust in the court? That it could be used to challenge future decisions, to question the legitimacy of this institution?" Denzel met her eyes. "That is precisely why it must happen. Because trust built on denial is not trust. It is theater." And with that, Roberts slowly stood. The room froze. Justices rarely stood during sessions. It was a signal, intentional, and unmistakable. "I would like to call a recess," he said quietly. "And I would like Mr. Washington to remain for a private session with the bench." Gasps fluttered through the gallery. Reporters scrambled to jot notes. Even seasoned analysts whispered in disbelief. A private session, with all 9 justices. For a man with no law degree, court was adjourned temporarily. The spectators were ushered out. The media held at bay. But the energy that lingered in the marble chamber was not one of drama. It was one of introspection. Inside the private chambers, the atmosphere was even more intimate. The long conference table was quiet as Denzel took a seat across from the robed figures who had, until that morning, barely considered him worthy of their time. Roberts broke the ice. "You were not wrong, and it pains me to say that." Denzel did not respond right away. He let the statement breathe. "What you saw in those files," Roberts continued, "we should have seen. What you heard from those people, we should have heard." Gorsuch leaned in. "Where did you learn to construct legal arguments with such precision?" Denzel smiled faintly. "By listening, and by reading everything this court has ever published. Every opinion, every dissent, every footnote." Barrett shook her head slowly, marveling. "You memorized entire rulings?" "I had to," he said, "because when you do not wear the robe, every word must be earned." There was a moment of silence again, but this time it was a silence of respect. Finally Roberts spoke again. "What would justice look like to you? Not in theory, in practice." Denzel exhaled deeply, knowing that this was his one chance to give the answer that would linger in their minds long after the session ended. "Justice," he said slowly, "would look like the court walking into the public square and saying, 'We hear you now.' It would look like a published opinion, not binding but honest, not authoritative but human. That is how you restore trust, not by defending power, but by admitting where it failed." The room was quiet once more, and for the first time in their collective memory, the justices had no objections. As the session ended and Denzel stepped back out into the hallway, he was met not with applause, but with a respectful silence. The kind that spoke volumes. The kind that marked the end of mockery and the beginning of reverence, because now there was no doubt left. This was not a celebrity trying to play lawyer. This was a man who had redefined what it meant to be heard. The press waited like wolves outside the courthouse doors. Cameras were poised, microphones extended, and headlines were already being drafted. But when the heavy wooden doors opened and Denzel Washington walked out, no one shouted questions. There was a reverent hush, as if the gravity of what had taken place inside had spilled onto the steps and into the nation's conscience. No one needed a quote. The look on his face said enough. Not triumphant, not smug, just resolute. Reporters scrambled to reframe their narratives. Gone were the snide headlines suggesting another Hollywood stunt. Gone were the whispers that this was all performance. In their place emerged a new understanding. A celebrity had not embarrassed the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had nearly embarrassed itself by failing to recognize the brilliance before them. Inside, the justices were still seated in chambers. The mood was somber, not out of shame, but out of realization. They had witnessed something rare, a moment when the weight of the law collided with the clarity of truth, and truth had prevailed. Justice Roberts stared out the window, his thoughts distant. "We often debate who the Constitution belongs to," he said softly. "Today, I was reminded it belongs to the people who understand its soul, not just its text." He turned to the others. "We will draft the statement." Gasps had filled the room again, not from the public this time, but from the clerks, the aides, the inner circle of the nation's highest legal minds. The Supreme Court would issue an official, though non-binding statement. A reflection, an admission, a reckoning. In ink. Days later, the nation sat on edge as the document was released. It did not blame past administrations. It did not point fingers at Congress. It did not disguise its humility behind legal jargon. It was raw, human, and deeply unsettling in its honesty. There were moments when this court remained silent, not out of legal necessity, but out of convenience. We failed to hear the quiet cries of those wronged by the machinery of justice. We acknowledge those failures, not as weakness, but as the beginning of restoration. The statement was signed unanimously. A symbolic act, yes, but symbolism in this case had teeth. Advocacy groups mobilized. Wrongfully convicted individuals came forward. Cases once ignored were re-examined. And the name Denzel Washington became a rallying cry, not just for justice, but for courage. But Denzel did not stay in the limelight. He declined interview requests. He turned down book deals. He ignored the flood of political invitations. Instead, he quietly started a foundation that funded legal education in underserved communities, scholarships, mentorships, public access to landmark case law, all spearheaded by the man once dismissed as a dramatic interloper. Meanwhile, law schools began including his appearance before the Supreme Court as a case study, not just in legal rhetoric, but in the power of moral clarity. There was a moment, months later, when Roberts ran into Denzel at a private event honoring contributors to public legal reform. The Chief Justice approached quietly, without entourage or title. "You made us uncomfortable," he said. "But that is exactly what we needed." Denzel smiled, his tone warm but firm. "The law is not supposed to be comfortable. It is supposed to be just." Roberts extended his hand. This time, there was no condescension in the gesture, no hierarchy, only respect. Across the country, those who had felt forgotten by the justice system watched all of this unfold and felt something they had not felt in a long time. Seen. For all his awards and accolades, it was this moment, this story, that would follow Denzel Washington for the rest of his life. Not a scene scripted for the screen, not a character written by others, but a stand taken in front of the highest court in the land, armed not with status, but with truth. And in doing so, he reminded America that legal genius is not always born in courtrooms. Sometimes it walks in from the outside and rewrites the script.